Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. This is part 2 of my conversation with Mr. Keir Martland about the Brexit referendum and the potential fallout from it. This episode was recorded prior to the appointment of Theresa May as Prime Minister. Mr. Martland is the Director of Publications at the Libertarian Alliance and the host of the Free Life podcast. He is the author of Liberty from a Beginner Selected Essays. You can follow his work at keirmartland.co.uk. That's KEIRMARTLAND.co.uk and at thelibertarianalliance.com. You can find him on Twitter at Keir J. Martland. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Brexit-2. You've mentioned this a little bit already, but I want to return to the subject of what this might mean for some of the various political parties and political leaders in Britain. Of course, David Cameron is resigning, and you said there are 5 candidates to replace him for the Conservative Party leadership. Who do you think will replace him? There's a lot of talk here about Boris Johnson maybe getting that role. Do you think it will be him? And what does this mean for Jeremy Corbyn and his position as the leader of the Labour Party? What does this mean for UKIP moving forward, the Liberal Democrats? What does all this mean as far as British politics go?
Okay. I think I'll have to disappoint a lot of Americans who seem to idolise Boris Johnson and think he's great. But first of all, he isn't great. But second, it won't be him. It can't be him, because as we're speaking now, the nominations for the leadership of the Conservative Party are closed. You see, it's not like the American primaries, and it's not like the leadership of other parties. The Conservative Party are great because they get it over with really quickly. And so David Cameron resigned, or announced his intention to resign, on the 24th of June. And by the 30th of June, the nominations for his successor were over and done with. So that's really smooth, really efficient, really quick. And what was absolutely amazing is that Boris Johnson, who I'll have to put this into context, I suppose, so people know why I'm not a massive fan of him.
Sure.
Boris Johnson has spent his entire political career being an enthusiastic supporter of the European Union. People forget this. People either forget this or they don't know it. He spent his entire career being a Europhile, as we call them, and suddenly, when it looked like his old rival David Cameron was going to be toppled at some point, Johnson decided to do a 180-degree turn and support leaving the European Union. And this was made crystal clear. This cynicism, the cynicism of Boris was made absolutely unambiguous when it was made known that he wrote 2 different articles for the publication for publication at the beginning of the referendum campaign. One of these articles advocated staying in the European Union, and one advocated leaving. And he decided at the very last moment which one he would publish. Based on the position of David Cameron, based on the line of the government, based on the polling figures, for people who want to leave and people who want to stay. And so we really have to regard Boris Johnson as a very cynical operator, basically, a political class operator, and really a bellwether. He's someone who is... he reflects public opinion. He doesn't shape it, and he will do anything for the top job. And he has a history of supporting things and then not supporting them. He's a very untrustworthy politician, and he is sometimes quite liberal and sometimes profoundly illiberal in the kinds of things that he supports. And so, while he may have quite justly a reputation for being a libertarian or something approaching it throughout the referendum campaign, the previous 20 years contradict that. And so, I have no trust in anything that Boris says. But it was almost taken for granted throughout the referendum campaign that he would end up in a leadership election following the resignation of David Cameron. And so much so that many people were suggesting that there should be no proper election. He should just be crowned leader. There should just be a coronation of Boris. And so he had a big campaign following David Cameron's resignation. He had a big campaign team assembled, and this campaign team was headed by Michael Gove, who is an arch neoconservative in the British Conservative Party, and something of a cultural leftist and something of a sort of modern reformer of, somebody who wants the state to be quite efficient and he's somebody who wants to give you all of the government that your taxes pay for, which to some people might sound quite libertarian, but to others it sounds quite sinister. And so he was heading Boris's campaign, and everyone took it for granted that there'd be no more uncertainty and no more developments following that. And then literally about an hour before nominations closed on the 30th of June, Michael Gove decided to stand for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And when you consider that Gove and Boris would have been competing for exactly the same people, they would be going for the same faction of the party, this made Boris's position completely untenable, and so he had to step aside. And I just thought that was the most brilliant, the most ruthless act in British politics that we've seen in a very long time. But of course, Michael Gove is no more qualified to be Prime Minister than Boris Johnson, based on his support for foreign intervention around the world, for various very statist measures. And so it can't be him. Plus, he's a very divisive figure. I don't really believe that he could win a general election against the Socialist Labour Party. And so there are various other contenders. And now that it's not, now that Boris isn't the front runner, it looks like Theresa May could be the front runner. Now, Theresa May has been our Home Secretary, or Secretary of the Interior, if you like, for the last 6 years. And she has a very just reputation for being for being somewhat fascistic. She is responsible for the Investigatory Powers Act, which gives the security services and the police the right to look through your phone records, the right to look on, the right to look through your social media and all of your metadata. A massive increase in the powers of the state. She's also been absolutely terrible in that she's given she's given all kinds of promises that she'll do various things and then done the exact opposite. Of course, politicians are usually like this, but she is remarkably talented, as a recent article in The Telegraph said. She's been really good at saying that she'll do things, or somehow not taking the blame for massive cock-ups in the Home Office, and so I really hope that it isn't Theresa May as well. And that leaves three other candidates: Stephen Crabb, who's this absolute nobody who campaigned to keep us in the European Union. So did Theresa May. And then there are two other candidates: Liam Fox, who's again an arch neoconservative, very, very staunchly pro-American in terms of foreign policy. And then the last candidate is a woman called Andrea Leadsom, and she seems the least bad of an absolutely awful bunch. Her Euroscepticism seems to be without any strings attached, if you see what I mean. She seems to just want us to leave the European Union, and that's it. But I must emphasise that the next Prime Minister will be probably no better than David Cameron. Or if better than David Cameron, only very, very, very slightly better than David Cameron. Every single contender for the leadership of the Conservative Party voted for the Iraq War, if they were in Parliament anyway. They voted for the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Libyan intervention in 2011. They voted for war in Syria in autumn 2013. They voted for intervention in Syria in December 2015. None of them have a very good reputation when it comes to civil liberties. And so, we don't really have very many good options. Even so, the Conservative Party seems to sense that the wind is blowing in our direction. People are starting to loathe these global institutions. People are starting to want more sovereignty, more self-determination. People are starting to want less crony capitalism, less corporatism. And so things may start to go in our direction, but again, I wouldn't hold your breath. As for the Labour Party, well, their position is quite amusing. They've seen a massive swell in their membership following the accession of Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership, but these members aren't the kind of members that you want. They're absolutely crazy. They're very young, very committed socialists. Absolutely, the concept of compromise, the concept of doing anything in a grown-up way is absolutely alien to them. And with recent scandals in the Labour Party concern people like Ken Livingstone, it's quite concerning that a large number of members of the Labour Party are quite openly anti-Semitic. And at the same time, these members are not members who will turn up to annual general meetings of the local party. And so you have this strange situation in the Labour Party where there's a very small number of people who do all the work. A small number of people in the parliamentary party, i.e. the MPs, and lots of local affiliation chairmen and so forth. They do the work of running the Labour Party. But they are vastly outnumbered by hundreds of thousands of absolute crazies who believe in renationalising massive chunks of the economy, who believe in a massive state, and who incidentally, they believe in one thing that I believe in. They believe in Tony Blair being put on trial for war crimes in The Hague and spending many years, if not the rest of his life, in prison. And so the Labour Party is tearing itself to pieces, and they've got a very uncooperative and vast membership base who don't do any work and who don't agree with them on anything. And so the Labour Party will soon enough either break up or just eat itself and fade into insignificance. As for the Liberal Democrats, they've already faded into insignificance. They have 8 members of Parliament. They have probably 8 members or something like that. And I suppose the only other parties worth mentioning are the Scottish National Party and UKIP. The Scottish National Party is a very dominant force in Scotland. And of course, you'll have heard of their demands for a second independence referendum following the Brexit vote. Of course, this could happen, but somehow I just don't think it will. I don't for a moment believe that the Scots are brave enough to vote for independence, and I don't for a moment believe that the kind of independence movement that we're seeing in Scotland is a genuine independence movement. Any comparison between people who want to leave the United Kingdom and create a so-called independent Scotland, any comparison between that and let's say the Texas secessionists or the people who voted to leave the European Union is a completely misplaced comparison. Because what people perhaps outside the European Union won't appreciate is that the Scottish National Party is a very left-wing party which wants essentially an independent Scotland, but with a massive state with lots and lots of free stuff. And of course, that's because this independence movement in Scotland isn't genuine. Many people say that it's a movement funded by the European Union, actually, to break up the United Kingdom and end up with various smaller satellite states of a federal European state. I don't know one way or the other, but it sounds plausible, because there's absolutely no way that you could have a smaller state than the United Kingdom having all of these free and publicly funded institutions like a national health service and like free education. Especially when this part of the United Kingdom is the most unproductive bit of the United Kingdom. It's like the north of Italy, I think, or the south of Italy. I forget which part. They're not very productive. They are tax eaters on net, and so I don't really believe that even if there was a second independence referendum, that Scotland would become an independent country. And as for UKIP. Well, today, and I'm speaking on the 4th of July, Treason Day, as we call it in Britain, Nigel Farage resigned as leader of UKIP. He's obviously, worn out from the many decades of campaigning tirelessly for British independence. But that then leaves a massive question mark over the future role of UKIP. And many of us had hoped that UKIP would be, again in the coming years, or at least in the coming months, a benign force which would hold the main two parties to account and make sure that they do go forward with Brexit. But if UKIP becomes split and divided and ineffective, then that might not work in our favour. But again, going back to the Conservative leadership, the best candidate is definitely Leadsom, because she is someone who says that we must invoke Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty as soon as is humanly possible. And what Nigel Farage has been warning against is backsliding. He's been warning against the British political class backsliding and going back on what they've been promising. And yet, without a strong Eurosceptic movement, in other words, without UKIP and without Euroscepticism within the Conservative Party, who knows? They could try to pull the wool over our eyes, and they could try to block Brexit, or they could say that we're going to have a general election to decide the issue once again. We just don't know at this time.
Okay, and you said in there that you don't think Scotland will become independent, but do you think we'll see any other territorial changes within the United Kingdom? Do you think we'll see more controversy over Gibraltar's status, maybe Spain trying to enforce their claims over Gibraltar? Do you think we'll see more movement towards Irish unification and changes in Northern Ireland's status? Do you think there will be any further changes in the territory that comprises the United Kingdom as part of the fallout of this?
Well, to address Ireland first, we sort of already have a united Ireland in all but name. In 1998, the British government effectively surrendered to the IRA, to the effect that now Sinn Féin, which is the political party wing of the terrorist group, the IRA, they now share power in the Northern Irish Assembly with the other political parties, which we think nothing of it. We think nothing of it because we all kissed and made up, and we all had a lovely peace process in Northern Ireland. Well, what if we decided that Hamas could share power with Israel? Or what if we decided that ISIS could share power with Syria? We have a very perverse situation in Northern Ireland already, and there are lots of hardcore unionists, in other words, people of English and Scottish extraction, living in Northern Ireland. They completely resent what was called the Good Friday Agreement. And so I think any questions about Northern Ireland have already been answered, and they've been answered in a very, very suspect way. As for Wales, I can't really see Wales ever seceding. Wales is far too small. That's not to say that in the future we won't have radical decentralisation in the future once all the proper work has been done. But I can't see through political means. I can't see through any kind of formal referendum, or certainly not in the way that Scotland did it. I can't see Wales doing the same. As for Gibraltar, I just don't know. Gibraltar did vote overwhelmingly in favour of staying in the European Union, and Gibraltar is quite some distance away from England, and so many people will probably say, well, let's abandon this last vestige of colonialism and focus on our own people. But then, of course, you have to say the same for the Falklands, and you have to say the same for all of the Channel Islands and everything. But these are all questions which I'm sure will be addressed in the future. Anything else, I think, is a distraction, to be perfectly honest, from the very pressing issue of just making sure that our own politicians invoke Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty as soon as is humanly possible. Andrea Leadsom says she will do it in September. Michael Gove says he will do it before next year. Theresa May says she will do it at some point next year. I don't know what the other candidates have said, but that there is a real danger of Brexit not happening, or not happening earnestly or sincerely. And so I know, for instance, that Boris Johnson, who isn't in the leadership election anymore, he wanted us to effectively stay in the single market and therefore keep free movement of people and so forth, but just be nominally outside of the European Union. This is not good enough. We need to be outside the European Union. And quite frankly, as Nigel Farage said, no deal at this point is better than any deal that we get from the European Union as a member of the European Union. And so we need to get out as soon as possible. And once we're out, whether we do it through invoking Article 50 or whether we just do it through repealing the European Communities Act, we have to get out properly and get out quickly. And then once we've done that, then we can start to restructure the economy. Then we can start to rebalance our political institutions. Then we can start to decentralize power in the ways that we were discussing just then. But the first step has to be to make sure that there is absolutely no chance that a government will betray the result of the referendum.
All right, so what would the process of the UK withdrawing from the EU look like? And how do you think it will play out? Should we be celebrating these results entirely? Or I know you still sound skeptical about what this actually means. So how do you think that will look?
Well, actually, myself and various other people in the Libertarian Alliance and friends of the Libertarian Alliance, we were getting rather skeptical about the supposed advantages of leaving the European Union in terms of geopolitics, because we were getting quite nervous that the majority of the politicians in the Conservative Party who were in favour of leaving the European Union were actually the most hardcore neoconservatives. And so what we fear, what we feared then, and we probably should still fear now, is that we would just jump out of the frying pan and into the fire. We would leave the European Union, only then to enter into some kind of either informal political union with America or whatever. I just we can't say with any certainty yet. But there is a real danger of ending up in a close alliance with America, which might end up doing as much harm to the world as the Iraq War ended up doing. And so we do have to be quite cautious and serious about what we are actually supporting. As for how the European Union exit strategy will happen, again, this hinges largely on how we do it. Every single candidate for the leadership of the Conservative Party supports the strategy of invoking Article 50. And, I personally wouldn't opt for this strategy, because the problem with invoking Article 50 is you are accepting the legitimacy of the European Union in doing that. It's the European Union approved exit strategy, and it says while you do it, you will still give us all the money that you give us. So we give the European Union about £8 billion a year net, and so we would still be contributing that money to the EU budget. We would still be getting the various grants and so forth that we get from the European Union with strings attached. We would still have to comply with European Union law. And also, there is a real possibility that the European Union would still expand while the Brexit was actually happening. And so Robert Henderson, who's one of the conservative commentators on this issue, has said that it's not entirely out there to envisage a situation where the European Union ended up flooding Britain with loads and loads of more immigrants, to put it bluntly, because the Article 50 strategy takes officially about 2 years. It could even take a bit longer. Well, in the knowledge that Britain will be in the European Union for only 2 years, it's entirely likely that many more Eastern European unskilled workers would travel to Britain in order to settle. And of course, once they get here, they are able to claim benefits almost from day one. And so we do have to make sure that we do it properly and that we get the best possible deal from Europe if we end up invoking Article 50. But even so, I would still urge the strategy that we should use is to simply repeal the European Communities Act 1972. And that way, you just wipe the European Union from history as if it never existed in legislative terms. And I think that would be a much more sensible way of doing it. It would be a much more productive use of our sovereignty in the short term. We have this new feeling of sovereignty. We have this new feeling of independence. Well, let's make sure that we use it quickly and we do it properly. And so, if we leave quickly and we leave on our own terms, and we don't do it through Article 50, I'm sure then we could get access to exactly the same access to European markets, or perhaps better. But again, I'm not holding my breath for any brilliant Brexit strategy from people who, a lot of them have spent their entire political career advocating ever closer political union with Brussels, European Union expansion. It's exciting political times, but nothing is certain at the moment.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for being so generous with your time, and I'm trying to sort of cover as many angles of this as possible. So there are two more things I want to ask you before we wrap up, and I really do appreciate how much time you're giving me and how generous you're being with your time. But two of the stories that have really dominated coverage in the U.S. are the market turbulence immediately following the referendum, and then what this means for the relations between the United Kingdom and the United States, and to a lesser degree, Canada, who's also been negotiating a quote-unquote free trade agreement with the European Union, and with current European Union members. So what does this mean as far as UK relations with those countries, and what do you make of the market turbulence in the immediate aftermath?
Well, the FTSE's back up to where it was before we left the European Union. The pound's still down, but I sense that's largely because of the political uncertainty within Britain. I mean, the pound was at about the pound to euro, and it was about 1.30. Now it's at about 1.19. But if you look at the political events, such as Boris no longer being the front runner for the Conservative leadership, all these political shocks seem to be having the most impact on the continued decline of the pound against the euro. So as soon as the politicians pull their fingers out and actually start planning for Brexit, I'm sure the markets will do better and the pound will strengthen. But I'm optimistic. I think we will do much better economically outside the European Union. We certainly have much more scope to do that. Whether the politicians take advantage of that is another matter. But it's ultimately a case of one of the 1975 European, strategies. Sorry, one of the slogans during the 1975 European Union referendum. It's a case of what they called out of Europe into the world. This is about Britain pursuing global ambitions, exporting all around the world, and having a much freer economy. And we can have free trade with Europe, but there's absolutely no reason to accept the whole body of European law on goods that we produce in this country for sale in this country. I mean, there's absolutely nothing unreasonable about the fact that British cars that we export to America are produced to drive on the other side of the road to the side that they drive over here, just as goods that we sell to Turkey will have labels in Turkish. But that's the way of the world. But we don't accept American law to be applied on goods that we just sell to each other in Britain. So our relationship with America, I can't see as being very, very different if we pursue a sensible strategy following Brexit. But again, I do fear, with people like Ted Cruz during the primaries and afterwards, saying that Britain and America should stand close by each other and we should have close relationships with America. I do fear that we may end up pursuing this awful special relationship, which has led to the deaths of so many innocents in the Middle East. As for Canada's so-called successful free trade deal with the European Union, this has been going on for years and years. I think is it 7 years or is it 10 years? And they still haven't negotiated complete free trade. And so the idea of the European Union as being about free trade is absurd. The European Union is quite simply a customs union. It's about the European Union isolating itself from the rest of the world. And that simply isn't good enough if you want to have an export-led growth strategy, as Britain's trying to do at the moment. our consumption isn't going anywhere. We're not getting very much investment, and we're not a very productive country at the moment. And so, what else can we do other than export? And so that's the logic behind the government's macroeconomic strategy anyway. And so if you want to do that, then it makes sense to be outside the European Union and trading and putting more and more emphasis on these other continents where we have a trade surplus rather than the only continent in the world where we have a trade deficit. And so geopolitics is all up in the air at the moment. Over the last few years, everything has just become completely unpredictable. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, up until a few years ago, the Cold War paradigm just hadn't become unstuck. America had still been thinking in exactly the same way as it had been before, and at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a real opportunity for the emergence of small states, national sovereignty, lots of small countries trading and cooperating with each other, but largely determining their own destiny, and perhaps even more radical centralization and the splitting up of states, and then the splitting up of those states and so forth. But what we actually saw was the growth of these global institutions, the European Union, the expansion of NATO, and of course NAFTA, and I don't think people have completely bought into them, and so perhaps we may end up seeing a step away from globalism and the resurgence of nationalism. Ultimately, I would hope this resurgence of nationalism would be a stepping stone, ultimately towards a much more decentralized, much more free society. But at the moment, everything's to play for.
Yeah, so do you think we'll see anti-EU movements pick up even more steam elsewhere? Do you think we'll see similar referendums in other EU member countries, maybe in Denmark or the Netherlands or Austria? And do you think also as part of the legacy of the Brexit vote, we'll see secessionist movements gain steam around the world, maybe in Catalonia or here in Texas or in northern Italy? Do you think we'll see that as part of the legacy of the Brexit?
Well, I would certainly hope so. And I would expect so in Europe, because Britain's political system is by far and away the most rigid, the most constrained, the most, I won't say fixed, but the most constricted. Because we have massive party machines which completely strangle any chance of new third parties which might contest their electoral power. We don't have a directly elected executive. Our executive is picked formally by the Queen, from the largest party in the legislature. And we have an electoral system called first past the post, which really punishes smaller parties like UKIP. Whereas in other countries like Germany, they have a form of proportional representation, or I think it's the alternative member system. In France, they have a more proportional electoral system, and so in all of these different countries where I think Euroscepticism is just as strong, there is a more open political system, and so these forces will probably do much better than they have in Europe, in Britain. The fact that in the British general election last year, the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, won 3.8 million votes and only one seat. But at the same time, the Scottish National Party won, I think, 56 seats with just 1.5 million votes. Puts things into perspective. Our electoral system, it doesn't bode well for people on our side. But certainly, I think we're going to see copycat movements in Europe and also around the world. We're seeing, whatever you might think about Donald Trump, we're seeing in his campaign resentment of big organizations, resentment of deals like NAFTA, and some kind of resurgent nationalism. And of course, nationalism in itself isn't, a perfectly good thing. It's not something that you want in itself. But nationalism, as opposed to globalism, is obviously a step in the right direction. And so Texas also has had its secessionist movement going for a while. The Free State Project in New Hampshire, I'm sure, will get some inspiration from Brexit, and probably Catalonia in Spain, and maybe the secessionist movement in Italy as well. And so, I hope all these movements continue, and I hope they do well. But I would also hope that all of these international movements actually follow what is going on in Britain, and they take they heed the lessons of the difficulties which we definitely will encounter over not just the coming months but the coming years. And certainly, if Brexit doesn't happen, I would hope that all of these international secession movements and anti-globalist movements try to learn the lessons of why it didn't happen. And ultimately, I think it will be. We will have to look into non-political strategies. We will have to look into technology-based strategies, such as Bitcoin, crypto finance. We'll have to look into other ways of breaking the monopoly of power that the state has, because already many of us are sensing that leaving the European Union may be much more difficult than it seems. It may be the European Union, as Peter Hitchens said, it may be Hotel California. You can check out, but you can't leave.
All right. Well, we'll see how what happens, and it'll obviously be interesting to follow the developments in the coming months and years, even if things aren't always encouraging at times. And of course, when things are encouraging, that makes it all the better. Yeah. But I want to thank you for being so generous with your time and for spending so much time talking to me today. And what are the best ways to follow your work, and what do you recommend someone read or listen to or watch if they're interested in learning more about what we've been discussing today?
Sure. Well, you can follow anything that I write on the Libertarian Alliance blog, which is thelibertarianalliance.com, or at my website, keirmartland.co.uk. I also occasionally write for websites like The Backbencher, which is thebackbencher.co.uk. And also, I think a lot of my stuff can also be found on attackthesystem.com. For good commentary on what's going on with the European Union and the Eurosceptic movement generally, you can follow people like Robert Henderson or people like Richard North, or in the mainstream media, Peter Hitchens or Peter Oborne, in the Mail on Sunday, and the Daily Mail or the Daily Express, I forget which, respectively. So just generally, make sure that you're well informed about these issues, or you may be prone to false optimism.
False optimism. Well,
yeah.
Well, hopefully there are reasons to correctly be optimistic, but
let's hope so.
We'll see how it goes. So thank you again for joining me, and I want to remind everybody to check out the show notes page for this episode. And since this is a two-parter, Part 1 will be at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Brexit, and Part 2 at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Brexit-2. And of course, that will be the place to find links to all of the resources we've discussed over the course of this episode. So thelibertarianalliance.com, keirmartland.co.uk, attackthesystem.com, everything that we've mentioned, as well as episodes that we've done on the topic of the Scottish referendum from a couple of years ago, and we also touched on British politics and the setup of the EU in that episode, as well as one on Texas secession, which is quasi-related to this topic, and we also talked about some of the benefits of decentralization in both of those episodes as well. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Brexit for part 1, wakeupcallpodcast.com/Brexit-2 for part 2. And both pages will have links to all of those resources. And I want to encourage everybody to follow us on Twitter at WUC Podcast, and to subscribe and rate and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher or another podcatcher, and to sign up for our email list to stay up to date on what's going on with the show. And Keir, thank you very much for joining me today, and again for being so generous with your time. And hopefully we can chat again in the near future.
Yes, I look forward to that. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.